I have made many an undergarment in my career, which is kind of the natural consequence of doing historical sewing because all the magic starts with the foundations, so one kind of ends up spending a lot of time on various degrees of undies. Today's undergarment of choice is mid-16th century flavored, in the form of a smock, which is the basic skin layer worn underneath everything else. These are constructed pretty much exactly the same for men and women during this period. It'll just be shortened to around mid-thigh for the men's version. So, everyone, hear ye. These are made from linen, which is pre-washed since these garments will need plenty of washing during their lives, and you really don't want to be met with any fabric shrinkage after you've made it into a thing that fits. The great thing about smocks, shifts, and chemises of all periods is that they tend to have roughly similar base construction of super simple squares and rectangles, making them very easy to cut out and assemble, and are great beginner's projects if you're looking for one. There will be some little differences in the details from era to era, which I'm very excited to explore once I get finished cutting everything out. Smock linens are hard-wearing and densely woven for workwear, or a lighter but still pretty densely woven linen of thinner yarns for the more expensive sort. The linen I have to work with here is neither of those two. Although it came highly recommended by a bunch of American reenactors, the linen that arrived in the post is distinctly modern quality, i.e., so poor that it inspired a furious hunt for any decent historical quality linens out there, which you can probably find elsewhere on the channel. Alas, this did not happen in time for this particular project, so just try not to weep at the knowledge that 4 months of hand-sewn, embroidered labor is going to wear to shreds in about 2 years as you watch this video. I have done enough of that for all of us. It's very important to get everything very on grain when working with linen, since linen has a lot of body to it, and the slightest deviation from the straight of grain line can cause the garment to hang in really weird ways. This is very easily done with plain weaves, like, for example, a plain weave linen like this one, by following one thread of the weave to ensure that your grain line is perfectly straight. Historically, this is very easy to do by picking up one of those threads with a pin and drawing it out of the weave, which leaves a perfect gap along which you can cut a very straight line. But for this to work with preferably minimal swearing, the yarns of the fabric have to actually be spun and strong. The yarns in this cheaply made modern linen are barely even twisted, so any attempt to draw out a thread resulted in said thread simply shredding into fiber. So my next best bet, although slightly less precise and definitely more difficult on the eyes, is to draw a line with a very sharp pencil along one of these yarns to get my very straight line, and I can use that to cut along. Not ideal, but it will work. I've actually cut out enough for 2 smocks here. One I will be making up in a simpler manner in more the style of the everyday Tudor, and the other of which will be getting quite the posh treatment for the more fashionable lady. I'm starting by getting the gores attached to the body pieces on both smocks. One gore on each side of the garment, and these are just getting attached on either side of the front piece, and it will just help to widen the bottom for ease of sitting and walking. All the stitching on these smocks is going to be done with the maximum strength of a backstitch in waxed linen thread, and all of the seam allowances are going to be turned and felled. While some corners can be cut and running stitches used on long seams of outer garments, we take no prisoners when it comes to undergarment sewing. Since these garments will be right next to the skin and will need frequent washing, they will need maximum strength. And maximum strength they will certainly have. I have seen, worn, and made all too many shifts and smocks in modern linens, and without fail, every single one of them wears into holes before a single seam comes undone. Whilst I get started on construction, I have set my colleague Marley loose on Blackwork Design to come up with the copious embroidery that'll decorate the posh smock. She's going through some original examples that survive from the period to work out some matching designs for the cuffs, collar, and neckline. Which sounds like a lot, but smocks of this period could have entire sleeves and entire chests intricately embroidered. So really, we have restrained ourselves in the name of this not taking 84 years. I've cut a 10-inch slit at the center front neckline of each to allow the head to get through. And this is just hemmed off with a narrow felled hem. At the center point where the fabric will see some pulling and stress and will be too narrow to turn comfortably, I'm just reinforcing this stress point by buttonhole stitching all around to reach the other side. Now I'm just adding 2 neck gussets along the shoulder seam of the front panels so that they line up with the neck edge. This will just help to open up that neckline a bit and help the smock want to sit comfortably around the shoulders instead of slipping back. These turned out to be a little bit on the smaller side with the seam allowances, so I would maybe try a slightly larger scrap next time, although it really did the trick. The smocks did stay where they were put, so I guess that's fine. And with my fronts prepared with gores and gussets, I can lay the back body piece on top and start attaching. Firstly, I'm lining up the shoulder seams and stitching those together, and you can probably at this point see those neck gussets coming into shape now. I know gussets can be very hard to verbally explain or even written-wise explain, but I hope they make sense when you see them visually. Then I can line up the side seams and start stitching those together. It helps to have the actual sleeve piece finished before doing this, so you can physically measure out that much room as to where to stop the side seam. But in the absence of this, you can just overestimate the sleeve length slightly and close the remaining seam when inserting the sleeves. Or you can stop midway through your side seam and go make the sleeves. Different periods tend to favor long or short sleeves according to fashion, but the 16th century in particular tends to sit pretty firmly in the long sleeve camp. So this is what I'm going to be doing. First things first is to get the sleeve gussets in. These will sit in the armpit and just give tons of room for arm movement. Seriously, I cannot fathom why modern garments have decided to just do away with gussets. They are so cool. Once the first side of the gusset is stitched on, the immediate adjacent edge of the square is pinned onto the other side of the sleeve to form a tube, where the gusset seam meets the sleeve seam in a Y shape. I know, once again, gussets can sound very confusing when explained, but hopefully the visual will make it make sense. The bottom 3 inches or so of the sleeve will be left split for the hand to get in and out. So I'm just hemming these off as well before finishing the long sleeve seam. I find it easiest to finish one short gusset seam before doing the whole long sleeve into second gusset seam all in one go for the cleanest finish. So now that I have sleeves, I can figure out how much room to leave at the top of my side seams and get those finished up. And then insert the sleeves. I went ahead and put a hem on both smocks, and it was at this point that I reached a standstill. There was simply no moving forward without weeks' worth of embroidery. Marley has come up with some stunning 1560s flavored embroidery design for the collar and cuffs, so it is time to transfer the design from paper to fabric in the historical way. This is done by pricking along the lines with a pin to allow for a colored dust to be passed through. In our case, we're using charcoal, but one could also use chalk for darker fabrics. This will create a nice dotted line along which we can trace over in quill and ink to get the pattern successfully transferred. It seems like a dangerous task to be using dark ink on white linen, but in a world without disappearing or iron-off pens, we used what we had. There are many examples of extant embroidered garments that still bear these basic ink lines where either the thread has worn away or the design was changed or was just not accurately covered in the first place, so I'm personally not too worried if any of the ink remains visible. It happened. I am really mad that the microphone died here and you can't hear. Apparently Marley gave me a reading with our beloved Office Hieronymus Bosch tarot deck, but it's anyone's guess as to what her interpretation was, so all ye tarot readers out there, if you would like to give this a go, please let us know our fortunes down in the comments. I have a sinking sensation it might have something to do with some Bosch-flavored depravity. The embroidery is done in a mixture of detached buttonhole stitch for filling in and chain stitch for outlining. When I tell you that blackwork is my new favorite hobby, this project went with me absolutely everywhere. On trains, on road trips, to multiple concerts, to hangouts. I can't even really tell you how long it took because it just became a feature of the little gaps in my day-to-day life for about a month and a half. It's very enjoyable. Blackwork, embroidery, crewel work, all sorts of needlework was done by women of all social classes, but especially women of upper classes who had more spare time. Decorative stitching, like blackwork, that could be incorporated into shirts and smocks and pillowcases and caps, were almost kind of a byproduct of just everyday passing the time. It was really cool to kind of spend a month almost stepping back into that mentality of, oh, I have a little gap in my day, a little bit of free time, why don't I pick up my needlework? In the same way that today we would pick up our phones to engage our minds, I found myself reaching for my blackwork to kind of give my hands something to fidget with, to have something to focus on. And I found that it really had that kind of distracting effect.
Oh my god, you're just a little snail.
But much to my disappointment, the cuffs were eventually finished. And whilst Marley gets on with the collar work, I'm off to finish up the simple smock that doesn't need the embroidery. The sleeve edges will get gathered into a simple folded cuff. So I'm just running a gathering thread of some unwaxed linen thread across that bottom edge to draw up into gathers. Then I can pin the collar and cuff strips onto their respective locations. The collar doesn't need any gathers, so it can just be pinned and backstitched on straight. But the cuffs are a little fruity. Each gather is individually stroked to line up neatly. This is a painstaking process, but unfortunately it is worth it in the neatness of the gathers, and historical seamstresses knew it. So alas, I must know it too. The cuff is then folded over to encase all of the messy edge and felled down. The same is done with the collar.
Okay, all that is left is to just add some attachments for the collar and for the cuffs. What am I gonna do? I'm not gonna do ties because ties feel like a lab safety hazard. So I think buttons or hooks.
The neckline of this smock will be closed with a simple linen thread-wrapped button and a button loop, which is basically just some thread loops reinforced all the way across with buttonhole stitches.
I just love a worked bar. They look so satisfying when they're done. Yeah.
The cuffs will each close with a button and buttonhole. Since there was a little bit of overlap room left in the cuff, might as well use it.
Wow, look at all that counted black work.
Of course, the moment we turn the camera on, I'm gonna start really messing it up.
Yeah, it's the curse.
Marley is just about finished with the collar embroidery. Look, we were a little ambitious at the beginning of this project 4 months ago. I wish we had been better at tracking our hours for this in what we assumed would be a simple project, so we didn't think it worth it. But what I can tell you is that approximately this much of the lattice work took one Lord of the Rings Extended Edition marathon to complete, so do with that information as you will. The collar consists of 2 faces, the swirly organic outer design which will match the cuffs, and this geometric counted lattice work that will line the collar and be seen when the top flips open slightly. I saw this on a 1560s portrait and fell absolutely in love with the detail. All of the embroidery work was done mounted on a layer of heavyweight linen, firstly to stabilize it and to give the frame something to hold on to, but also to help stiffen the collar and cuffs, since historically these would want to be quite stiff, and if we couldn't do that with linens, which often I believe they were, we would be heavily reinforcing them with starch. So this will just help to make that job a lot easier. Oh, and there are also some frills on the edge of both collar and cuffs, which have been edged in a black blanket stitch. These will get box pleated onto the edges because if one is not wearing a separate suit of ruffs in the mid-16th century, one must at least have some built-in frills. The cuffs only have one layer and are backed with more of the same outer linen as the lining, so they're slightly lighter weight than the collar, which it turns out has double the backing and ended up being quite thick. I thought it might be too thick, but I think it ended up okay in the end after a really good gut clean and some heavy-handed stitching to really smush it flat. The cuffs have been treated in exactly the same way and will likewise be getting some buttons, 2 of them this time to account for the wider cuff width.
So cute. So cute. Ah.
And a little hand-wrought hook and eye closure at the neck for a little variation. And these smocks are good to go. Truly, these plain cotton basic undergarment projects are perhaps maybe the least visually interesting, but certainly some of my favorite projects to work on. It's a lot of good, plain, structural hand stitching, which is something that I just love doing. Add into that my brand new fascination with blackwork, and this project was just so much fun to complete. So why, you might ask, did I just spend 4.5 months hand sewing and hand embroidering a couple of undergarments? Because I enjoyed it, because it was really fun. I don't, it should be noted, think that historically they would have taken this long. Both of these projects were done around other day-to-day work in my life. So I wasn't 100% working on these garments all day, every day, in a way that a professional shirt maker or seamstress would have been doing in the period. I think easily one could get a basic smock out in a week or even less. The embroidery, on the other hand, was the really time-consuming part. Hands down, the black work on the posh smock took definitely longer. I want to say, if not 2 or 3 times longer than the actual smock construction. It was really cool stepping back into that mentality of, oh, I have a little gap in my day while waiting for the bus, or while waiting for my concert to start. Why don't I pick up my needlework? So I definitely expect to be incorporating more embroidery into future projects going forward. I'm very pleased with how these garments came out. They're not only great for whatever the historical purpose I've made them for, but they're also just really comfy garments to wear around. They never disappoint.
Swish, 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 swish.
I just love smocks and shifts. I would live in these. I'm going to. These are garments that are meant to be worn, loved, used, and eventually will fall apart. They're all biodegradable materials. They can be recycled down into, historically, paper, rags, and eventually just put back into the ground whence they came. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed coming along with me on this journey. These smocks were part of a bigger 16th century project, the kirtles of which go on top of these smocks have actually already been released. So if you missed that video, I will link it somewhere on screen for you to go and check out now. Or if you were really wanting the tea on those good or bad quality, historical or modern quality linens out there, that video is also on the channel for you to go check out if you missed that one. Anyway, I shall see you back here anon.
Pink Party Club! I'm ready for dancing at the Pink Party Club! I love it. That was beautiful.
Oh, we're such a mess.
Milk.
No!
We got bread on deck.
Bread on the floor.
Full supermodel work, work, bone structure.
Oh, getting too old for these shenanigans.